She walked into that wedding like a woman with nothing to prove, which, as it turns out, is exactly what someone looks like when they already own the room. Most people at an event like this come carrying something, an achievement to mention, a ring to flash, a story to make themselves sound further along than they really are. Bianca carried none of that. And somehow, that was the most unsettling thing about her. The wedding ballroom is dressed in warmth, the kind of golden light that makes ordinary people feel more certain of themselves than they have any right to be. Crystal chandeliers hang like frozen waterfalls overhead, scattering soft light across pressed suits and perfumed shoulders. Somewhere near the entrance, Bianca stands still, fingers curled tight at her sides, coaching herself through a breath she hopes no one notices. She has rehearsed this walk 100 times. Shoulders settled, chin lifted, eyes forward. Walk in like you are not the girl they spent years discussing over dinner tables. Walk in like you are not the one they still expect to find carrying the quiet shame of being 30 and unattached. Walk in like their story about you never had a single page that was true. Only she is not alone. Beside her, standing with the kind of stillness that does not belong to men who are merely confident, Dante Montale watches the room. To anyone glancing over, he is simply a tall man in a very well-fitted dark suit, with ink crawling up the side of his neck, and a jaw that looks like it was carved by someone who took the assignment seriously. His eyes do not move the way a curious guest's eyes move. They scan, they calculate, they settle. There is a particular psychology to the way dangerous men hold a room, not with noise, but with a gravity that makes other people unconsciously adjust their posture without knowing why. Dante Montale has that quality in abundance, and Bianca feels it the way a person lost at sea, finally, feels solid ground rise up to meet them. His hand shifts almost imperceptibly, just enough for his fingers to graze the back of hers, not pulling, not pushing, just present. It is the quietest possible way of saying, I see you and you are not falling tonight. You do not have to walk through that door, he says, his voice low enough to belong only to her, nearly swallowed by the swell of string music behind them. There is no debt you owe this room. Bianca lets out a short breath of a laugh, the kind that escapes before you give it permission. If I leave now, she says, they will just say, see, still the same girl who could never hold herself together. Dante does not rush to answer. He turns his gaze on her profile for a moment, and there is nothing in his expression that resembles pity, only a kind of unhurried attention that she has never quite gotten used to, even now. Is it their opinion you fear, he asks, or the version of yourself they keep trying to resurrect? She thinks about that. She thinks about the years of whispers, the casual cruelty dressed up as concern, the way people hand you a smaller version of yourself and then act confused when you refuse to hold it. I stopped being afraid of what they think a long time ago, she says finally. I am just done letting them believe their version of my life is the one that counts. The corner of Dante's mouth shifts, not quite a smile, more like the expression of a man who has witnessed enough of the world to recognize a quiet kind of courage when it stands right beside him. Then we walk in, he says simply. And if anyone in that room tries to rewrite your story tonight, they will find that the author is no longer taking requests. Bianca glances at him sideways. You cannot intimidate my old classmates at a wedding, Dante. He says nothing for a moment, only straightens his jacket and looks ahead toward the open ballroom doors, completely unbothered. I never intimidate anyone, he replies, his voice carrying the calm of a man who has never once needed to raise it. I simply remind people of what they already know. Hey guys, if this story already has you on the edge of your seat, please do not watch alone. Go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button right now. Tell us where you are watching from in the comments section. We would love to hear from you. Now let's get back to it. The moment Bianca crossed that threshold, the room did what rooms full of people who know each other always do. It noticed. Not all at once and not loudly, but in the way that a ripple moves across still water, one head turning, then another, then a quiet elbow nudging a quiet shoulder. She felt it before she saw it. The crimson gown had been her sister's idea, and Bianca had argued against it for a full 20 minutes on the grounds that red was too loud, too deliberate, too much of a statement for a day that was supposed to belong to someone else. Her sister had listened patiently to every word of that argument and then hung the dress on the back of Bianca's door anyway. Standing in the ballroom now, with the light catching the fabric every time she moved, Bianca was beginning to understand that her sister had known something she had not been ready to admit to herself. That showing up quietly was never really going to be an option tonight. Not here, not among these people, not with this history sitting in the room like an uninvited guest that had somehow gotten itself a seat at the head table. She kept her eyes forward and her steps measured, the way she had practiced, the way she had promised herself she would. But her mind was doing something altogether different from her body. Her mind was cataloguing every exit. The double doors to the left led back to the lobby and from there to the street, and she had already calculated that she could be in a cab within 4 minutes if she needed to be. She knew that because she had calculated it twice, once on the drive over and once while standing outside working up the nerve to come in. Dante noticed. He had a particular talent for reading the specific tension that lives in a person's shoulders when their body is present, but their plans are already somewhere else entirely. The doors to the left, he said, falling into step just slightly behind her right shoulder. Or there is a side exit past the catering station that would be faster and considerably less dramatic. Bianca did not look at him. "I am not leaving," she said. "I did not say you were," he replied evenly. "I am simply making sure you know that the option exists, because people tend to feel braver when they know they have a way out." She slowed her steps just slightly, and something in her chest loosened by a fraction. That was the thing about Dante that she had never quite been able to explain to anyone who asked about him. He did not push. He did not perform strength for an audience or use his presence to make decisions for her. He simply made sure she never felt cornered, and then he stood back and let her choose. It was a quality she had come to realize that most people who have real power share, because they have nothing left to prove by forcing anyone's hand. Bianca lifted her chin and let her eyes sweep the room properly for the first time since walking in. There were faces she recognized, and faces she had spent years trying to forget, and somewhere in the middle of all of them, a night she had not yet lived was already beginning. She smoothed the front of the crimson gown with one hand. "Then let them look," she said quietly. And she walked further in. There is a particular kind of man who enters a room and makes everyone in it subtly aware that the social order has just been quietly rearranged. Not because he announces it, not because he demands it, but because something in the way he moves suggests, without a single word, that he has already seen everything this room has to offer and has simply chosen to be polite about it. Dante Montale was that kind of man. He was not the tallest person at the wedding, nor the loudest, nor the one draped in the most obvious signs of wealth, and yet something about him made the room's natural hierarchy tilt almost imperceptibly in his direction the moment he walked through the door. People noticed him the way they notice a change in weather, not by seeing it directly, but by feeling the shift in the air around them. What none of them could have known, standing there with their champagne flutes and their quiet assumptions, was that Dante's most disarming quality had absolutely nothing to do with the power he carried. It was what he chose to do with it when no one important was watching. A young waiter, no older than 19, was making his careful way through the reception crowd, balancing a tray of champagne flutes with the focused concentration of someone who had been warned, probably more than once, not to drop anything tonight. He clipped the edge of a guest's elbow, and the tray lurched dangerously to one side. It did not fall, because Dante's hand was already there, steady and completely unhurried, as though he had seen it coming 3 steps before it happened. Which, knowing Dante, Bianca thought he very likely had. The boy exhaled visibly, his face flushing with the particular embarrassment of someone who has just been rescued in public and is not entirely sure how to carry the gratitude. Dante said something to him, low and brief, and whatever it was made the young waiter's shoulders drop from around his ears before he moved on with considerably more confidence than he'd had 30 seconds ago. Bianca watched this from 2 steps away and felt something she had no clean word for settle in her chest. It was not surprise, because Dante never surprised her in this way anymore. It was closer to the quiet satisfaction of watching something you already know to be true prove itself in front of witnesses. A few nearby guests had caught the small exchange, and were now studying Dante with the particular curiosity of people who cannot quite place a person, but are very certain they should be able to. One man in a grey suit leaned slightly toward his companion and said something behind his glass. Bianca caught the tail end of it without trying. "Who is he with?" His companion glanced over, taking in the tailored jacket, the ink at Dante's collar, the easy and unbothered way he stood in a room full of strangers. "No idea," she murmured back, "but whoever she is, she clearly came with the right person." Bianca kept her expression completely neutral and took a slow sip from the glass she had collected on her way in. Dante turned back to her then, unhurried as always, his eyes carrying none of the self-satisfaction that a smaller man might have worn after a moment like that. "You are staring," he said. "I am observing," Bianca replied, her voice perfectly even. He considered that for a brief moment, then gave a single nod, as though the distinction was both noted and accepted. And then his eyes moved back across the room, already reading it, already 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the building. Bianca followed his gaze and felt the familiar charge of a night that had not yet decided what it was going to become. The first person to recognize her was Sandra Meeks. Bianca knew it was Sandra before she even turned around, because Sandra had always had a particular kind of laugh, bright, and just a little too generous, the laugh of someone who uses warmth as a first impression and stores the sharper things for later. "Bianca, oh my goodness, you actually came." The way she said it carried the faint suggestion that this had been a matter of some debate among people who were not Bianca. "Sandra," Bianca smiled with the full and practiced ease of a woman who had long since stopped needing anyone's approval to feel welcome in a room. "You look wonderful." Sandra did look wonderful, and she knew it, and the knowing of it was threaded through everything about her, the way she stood, the way her eyes moved, the way she reached out to touch Bianca's arm with the proprietary familiarity of someone reclaiming an old territory. "We were literally just talking about you," Sandra said, gesturing vaguely toward a small cluster of familiar faces gathered near the far end of the reception table. Bianca did not need to ask what they had been saying. She already knew the shape of that conversation, because it was the same conversation they had been having about her for the better part of a decade, passed around at gatherings like a dish. Everyone had tasted so many times, they no longer needed to look at it to know what was in it. Still single. Still no ring. Still the one they shook their heads about with the particular tenderness people reserve for someone they have privately given up on. She moved with Sandra toward the group, and watched their faces do the thing faces do when they are trying to compose a reaction faster than their actual feelings will allow. There were smiles, genuine ones mixed in with the careful ones, and then there were eyes that moved, almost involuntarily, to her left hand. She let them look. The hand was bare and had been for 30 years and would remain so until she personally decided otherwise, and she had made a quiet peace with that fact long before any of the people in this circle had thought to make it their concern. "You haven't changed at all," someone said, and it was offered as a compliment but landed as something more complicated, the way that particular sentence always does when it comes from someone who expected you to look more weathered by your circumstances. "Neither have you," Bianca replied pleasantly, and meant it in the most neutral way possible. The whispers, when they came, were not even particularly discreet. She caught fragments the way you catch weather through a cracked window, enough to feel it without being fully inside it. "Still on her own," I heard. 30 and not even close, apparently. Such a shame, she was always so. She did not wait to hear what she had always been so. She had spent a significant portion of her 20s waiting to hear the end of that sentence from various mouths, and had eventually concluded that the ending was never going to be worth the waiting. Instead, she reached calmly for a canapé from a passing tray, took a composed bite, and let the whispers move around her the way wind moves around something that has decided, at its core, not to be moved. 30 was not a verdict. It was simply a number, and numbers had never once frightened a woman who spent her days managing 9 figures of other people's money. She almost smiled at that. Almost. Bianca had just excused herself from Sandra's circle when she noticed Dante had gone still on the other side of the room. Not the kind of still that meant trouble. She had learned to read that particular stillness, and it had a different quality entirely, sharper, like the air before a storm decides what it wants to do. This was quieter than that. She followed his gaze and found it resting on a woman seated alone near the edge of the reception area, in the chairs that had been arranged against the wall the way chairs always are at events like this, designed to hold people temporarily while they wait for someone to come back for them. The woman was older, perhaps in her late 60s, wearing a modest floral dress that had clearly been chosen with great care and was equally clearly from a different tax bracket than the rest of the room's wardrobe. She had the composed, slightly upright posture of someone who has decided that dignity is a thing you carry on the inside when the outside circumstances stop cooperating. A small clutch bag sat on her lap, and her eyes moved pleasantly around the room with the expression of a woman who was used to watching other people's parties from a comfortable and unbothered distance. She was the bride's aunt, Bianca would later learn, who had travelled 6 hours by bus to be there and had been warmly welcomed at the ceremony, and then, in the quiet shuffle of the reception, had somehow been absorbed into the furniture. Nobody was being deliberately cruel about it. That was almost the worst part. It was simply that she did not fit the aesthetic of the conversations happening around her, and so the conversations continued without her, the way a river moves around a stone, not out of malice but out of simple momentum. Dante excused himself from the person he had been standing beside, a gesture so natural and unhurried that the person barely registered he had gone, and crossed the room. He did not make an announcement of it. He simply pulled a chair from the nearest table, positioned it beside the woman, sat down, and introduced himself in the same tone he used for everyone, which was to say, with the full and unperformed attention of a man who had nowhere more important to be. Bianca watched from across the room, her glass held loosely in one hand, as the woman's posture shifted almost immediately, the careful uprightness softening into something more relaxed, more present, as though someone had simply told her body it was allowed to settle. Within 2 minutes the woman was talking, her hands moving the way hands do when a person stops performing composure and starts actually conversing, and Dante was leaning slightly forward in his chair, listening with the focused interest of someone receiving genuinely useful information. A few guests nearby noticed, and exchanged the particular look that people exchange when something does not quite fit their map of the room. A man like Dante, seated against the wall with the bride's overlooked aunt, apparently content to be precisely where he was. It confused them. It was supposed to. Because power that needs an audience to feel real is not power at all, it is theatre. And Dante Montale had never once in his life needed the theatre. Bianca turned back toward the room and felt something she could only describe as certainty settle across her shoulders like a hand. She had chosen well. Not because Dante was formidable, though he was, but because he was good, and in her experience, those two things together were considerably rarer than most people realized. Bianca had just excused herself from Sandra's circle when she noticed Dante had gone still on the other side of the room. Not the kind of still that meant trouble. She had learned to read that particular stillness, and it had a different quality entirely, sharper, like the air before a storm decides what it wants to do. This was quieter than that. She followed his gaze and found it resting on a woman seated alone near the edge of the reception area, in the chairs that had been arranged against the wall the way chairs always are at events like this, designed to hold people temporarily while they wait for someone to come back for them. The woman was older, perhaps in her late 60s, wearing a modest floral dress that had clearly been chosen with great care and was equally clearly from a different tax bracket than the rest of the room's wardrobe. She had the composed, slightly upright posture of someone who has decided that dignity is a thing you carry on the inside when the outside circumstances stop cooperating. A small clutch bag sat on her lap, and her eyes moved pleasantly around the room with the expression of a woman who was used to watching other people's parties from a comfortable and unbothered distance. She was the bride's aunt, Bianca would later learn, who had travelled 6 hours by bus to be there and had been warmly welcomed at the ceremony, and then, in the quiet shuffle of the reception, had somehow been absorbed into the furniture. Nobody was being deliberately cruel about it. That was almost the worst part. It was simply that she did not fit the aesthetic of the conversations happening around her, and so the conversations continued without her, the way a river moves around a stone, not out of malice, but out of simple momentum. Dante excused himself from the person he had been standing beside, a gesture so natural and unhurried that the person barely registered he had gone, and crossed the room. He did not make an announcement of it. He simply pulled a chair from the nearest table, positioned it beside the woman, sat down, and introduced himself in the same tone he used for everyone, which was to say, with the full and unperformed attention of a man who had nowhere more important to be. Bianca watched from across the room, her glass held loosely in one hand, as the woman's posture shifted almost immediately, the careful uprightness softening into something more relaxed, more present, as though someone had simply told her body it was allowed to settle. Within 2 minutes the woman was talking, her hands moving the way hands do when a person stops performing composure and starts actually conversing, and Dante was leaning slightly forward in his chair, listening with the focused interest of someone receiving genuinely useful information. A few guests nearby noticed, and exchanged the particular look that people exchange when something does not quite fit their map of the room. A man like Dante, seated against the wall with the bride's overlooked aunt, apparently content to be precisely where he was. It confused them. It was supposed to. Because power that needs an audience to feel real is not power at all, it is theatre, and Dante Montale had never once in his life needed the theatre. Bianca turned back toward the room, and felt something she could only describe as certainty settle across her shoulders like a hand. She had chosen well. Not because Dante was formidable, though he was, but because he was good, and in her experience, those two things together were considerably rarer than most people realized. It was Sandra who started it, because it was always Sandra. She had drifted back toward Bianca with the particular momentum of a woman who has just thought of something she considers too interesting to keep to herself, and she arrived wearing the expression of someone delivering a kindness that is only partially a kindness. "We were wondering," Sandra began, with the careful casualness of a sentence that had been rehearsed at least once, "if you came alone tonight, Bianca." The cluster of former classmates that had reassembled nearby did not look over all at once, which meant they had all been listening, which meant the question had been coordinated, which meant Sandra had volunteered to ask it on behalf of the group. Bianca recognized the architecture of it immediately. She had grown up around these people. She knew exactly how they built these moments, brick by brick, dressed in smiles, until the structure was tall enough to make someone feel small standing next to it. "Actually," Bianca said, her voice carrying the relaxed and faintly amused quality of a woman who has just been asked a question with a very satisfying answer, "I did not." Sandra's smile held, but her eyes moved, scanning the immediate area with the quick efficiency of someone taking inventory. And then Dante was there. He had the quiet but absolute way of arriving beside Bianca that suggested he had not hurried, had not needed to, had simply concluded that this was where he was supposed to be and had come accordingly. He settled at her shoulder with the naturalness of someone returning to a place that had always been his, and the shift in the circle was immediate and unanimous. Back straightened. Expressions recalibrated. The room's unspoken social mathematics began hurriedly revising its earlier conclusions about Bianca's evening. Sandra recovered fastest because Sandra always did. "I don't think we've met," she said, extending a hand and producing the particular smile she reserved for people she had instantly decided were worth impressing. Dante took her hand with the easy courtesy that cost him nothing and meant even less. "Dante Montale," he said simply. "And you are a friend of Bianca's?" It was not a question, which was somehow more unsettling than if it had been. Sandra laughed, the bright, generous one, deployed now at full strength. "An old classmate," she said. "We go way back, Bianca and I." "Then you have known her a long time," Dante said, with a warmth that was entirely genuine and an implication that was entirely deliberate. "Long enough to know how extraordinary she is." The circle was very quiet for a moment. Not the uncomfortable kind of quiet, but the kind that happens when a room full of people simultaneously realize they have been operating with incomplete information and are now hastily revising. Sandra's eyes moved between Dante and Bianca with the transparent curiosity of a woman doing arithmetic she had not expected to need tonight. "Are you two?" she began. "Partners," Dante said, and the word landed with a clean and unambiguous weight. He did not elaborate, did not qualify it, did not offer the kind of additional context that people provide when they are hoping to be believed. He simply said it the way a person states a fact that has been true for long enough that explaining it feels unnecessary. Bianca reached for her glass from a nearby surface and took a composed sip, watching Sandra's expression complete its full and deeply satisfying journey from pity to recalibration. It had taken the word exactly 1 second to rearrange everything these people thought they knew about her evening, her life, and the quiet story they had been telling about her for years. One word. 30 years in the making. The thing about Julian Reese was that he had always known exactly how much room he was taking up, and had never once considered taking up less. He was the kind of man who entered spaces the way weather enters a room when someone leaves a window open in a storm, announced, unavoidable, and somehow everyone else's problem to manage. He had been a groomsman since the beginning of the evening, which had given him both a corsage and a sense of authority that Bianca suspected he had been waiting his whole adult life to combine. She heard him before she saw him, the booming, backslapping laugh that had not changed a single note since high school, still carrying the same frequency it always had, the one that said, "I am having a wonderful time and I would like you to know it is partly at your expense." He was working his way through the reception the way people like Julian always do, loudly and with great enthusiasm, collecting laughs and leaving mild discomfort in his wake like a man who has never had to clean up after himself. Bianca tracked him in her peripheral vision and made a quiet calculation about the geometry of the room. Whether she could redirect her path enough to put sufficient distance between herself and his trajectory, without it being obvious that she was doing exactly that. She could not. Julian spotted her the way a searchlight finds what it was always going to find, not because it is clever, but because it never stops sweeping. Bianca Cole. He said her name the way people say the punchline of a joke they have been waiting all evening to deliver. He was already grinning as he crossed toward her, the kind of grin that comes fully assembled before the conversation has even begun, which told her everything she needed to know about what the conversation was going to be. "Still showing up to other people's weddings solo, I see." He said it loudly enough that Sandra, standing 2 feet away, heard it clearly. Loudly enough that the small constellation of nearby guests turned with the instinctive curiosity of people who have just detected the specific frequency of social discomfort. Loudly enough that it was not a comment at all, but a performance, and the audience had just been handed their seats without being asked. Bianca looked at him with the calm, level gaze of a woman who has long since stopped being surprised by the size of the spaces that small people need to occupy. "Julian," she said pleasantly, "you look exactly the same." She meant it as a statement of fact and allowed him to interpret it however his confidence would permit. Julian laughed the full generous laugh, feeding on the attention the way he always had, the way he always needed to. 30 years old and still flying without a co-pilot, he continued, gesturing toward her with his champagne glass in the manner of someone making a toast to themselves. "Somebody should have warned me to bring a +1 on your behalf." There was laughter from somewhere to her left. Not cruel laughter, the polite, reflexive kind that people produce when they are uncertain whether something is funny, but do not want to be the only one in the room who is not smiling. That particular kind of laughter was in many ways worse. Bianca did not look toward it. She kept her eyes on Julian with the patient and slightly bored expression of a woman watching a storm she has already calculated will pass. And behind her, with the absolute stillness of a man who has just decided that the room's arithmetic is about to change significantly, Dante Montale set down his glass. Julian was still riding the wave of his own laughter when Bianca smiled at him, slowly, and with the patience of someone who has decided that the most devastating response available to her is absolutely no response at all. It was not the smile of a woman who had been wounded. It was the smile of a woman who had already seen the end of the evening and found it satisfying. Julian's grin faltered for just a fraction of a second, the way a flame flickers when the air in a room changes, and then he recovered it, because men like Julian always recovered, right up until the moment they could not. That moment arrived through the side entrance. There were 3 of them, dressed well enough to pass a first glance, but carrying themselves with the particular economy of movement that belongs to men who are not here to celebrate anything. The room noticed them the way a body notices a drop in temperature, not immediately, not all at once, but in a slow and spreading awareness that moved from table to table until the music seemed slightly too loud for what the air in the room had quietly become. Julian noticed them third, which was interesting, because most men in his position would have noticed them first. But then, most men in his position would have been paying considerably closer attention to the door, and considerably less to Bianca. She watched the colour leave his face with the clinical detachment of someone observing a reaction they had read about, but never personally witnessed at this scale. He set his champagne down. The grin, that broad and weaponized grin that had been Julian Reese's calling card since the age of 17, folded in on itself and went somewhere very private. Julian, the man in front, spoke quietly, which in Bianca's experience meant he had never needed to be loud to be understood. Mr. Carver sends his regards and asks that you not make this a longer conversation than it needs to be. The reception had gone very still. The string quartet, bless them, continued playing for approximately 4 more seconds before the violinist noticed the room and let the music taper into silence with the resigned instinct of a professional who has learned to read a crowd. Dante moved. Not dramatically, not in the way that draws every eye in a room, but Bianca felt it the way she always felt his movements, as a shift in the weight of the air around her. He was already positioning himself between the men and the nearest cluster of guests, his posture carrying the quiet authority of a man who has resolved considerably more complicated situations than this one. Dante. Her voice was quiet, but it landed with the precise weight she had intended. He stopped. He turned and looked at her with the expression he reserved for moments when she reminded him, without negotiation, of the order of things between them. Because that was the part of the word partner that this room had not yet understood. It was accurate, every syllable of it, only the partnership had never been the kind these people had assumed when Dante said it, and Bianca had let them assume it because correcting them had never been any of her business. Until now. She walked forward with the unhurried composure of a woman crossing a room she owns, which in every way that mattered she did. I know what Julian owes, she said, addressing the man in front with the direct and businesslike calm of someone who has had this category of conversation before and found it largely unremarkable. I know who he owes it to, and I know what Carver's standard terms are for settlement. The man's expression did not change, but his stillness deepened in a way that meant he was reassessing. You are, he asked carefully. The person, Bianca replied, whose signature clears every significant transaction that passes through the Montale financial structure. The silence that followed was a different quality, entirely from the one the room had been holding a moment ago. She heard Sandra somewhere behind her make a sound that was not quite a word. She did not turn around. Dante runs operations, she continued, her voice carrying the same measured tone she used in boardrooms, because that was precisely what this had become. I run the finances, the strategy, and the decisions that determine which debts get settled and how. The man in front processed this with the careful expression of someone who had arrived with very different expectations. His eyes moved to Dante. Dante said nothing. He simply stood exactly where he was, with the composed and absolute stillness of a man who has just been accurately described and has no corrections to offer. Which was, in its own way, the loudest confirmation in the room. The room was waiting. That was the only way to describe it accurately. Every person in that ballroom suspended in the particular stillness of people who have stopped pretending to do anything other than watch what happens next. The bride was somewhere near the back, her new husband's hand wrapped around hers, both of them smart enough to stay exactly where they were. The string quartet had not resumed. Even the candles seemed to be holding their breath. Bianca let the silence sit for one more measured moment, then she turned and looked at Julian directly. He was not the man who had walked into that reception 2 hours ago. That man had been loud and certain, and armed with a lifetime's worth of casual confidence that he had never once had reason to question. The man standing in front of her now was smaller than that, not in any physical sense, but in the way that a person becomes smaller when the scaffolding they have been leaning on for years is suddenly and publicly removed. He could not quite meet her eyes, and was working very hard to look like that was a choice. It was not a choice. "Julian," she said, and her voice carried none of the sharpness that the room was probably expecting, none of the satisfaction that the room would frankly have forgiven her for, given the evening he had put her through. It was simply her voice, measured and clear, the same voice she used when she had already made a decision and was now in the business of executing it. "How much?" she asked, directing the question back to the man in front without breaking her gaze from Julian. The figure that followed was not a small one. She heard it move through the room like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward in sharp little intakes of breath and exchanged glances. Julian closed his eyes briefly, which was the most honest thing he had done all evening. Bianca nodded once, the way she nodded in meetings when a number had been confirmed, and the next step was simply administration. "I will have it cleared through the Montale account by 9 tomorrow morning," she said, "with Carver's standard processing fee included, so there is no further conversation required after tonight." The man in front studied her for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating their understanding of a situation they thought they had walked into fully briefed. "That is generous," he said carefully. "It is practical," Bianca replied. "There is a wedding happening in this room, and none of what brought you here tonight is the business of the people in it." He accepted that with a single nod, said something brief and quiet to the two men behind him, and the three of them moved back toward the side entrance with considerably less disruption than they had arrived with. The room exhaled. Bianca turned back to Julian and found him standing exactly where she had left him, which told her that whatever else tonight had taken from him, it had at least taken the capacity for a careless exit. "Bianca," he started, and the word came out stripped of everything that usually lived inside his voice when he said her name. No performance, no audience, no architecture of casual cruelty, carefully assembled for maximum effect. Just a man at the end of an evening, holding the wreckage of a version of himself he could no longer defend. She looked at him for a long moment. "Go and enjoy the wedding, Julian," she said simply. Not as a forgiveness exactly. More as a door she had chosen to open because keeping it closed would have required her to keep standing there, and she had somewhere much better to be. She turned and walked back toward Dante, and she did not look back. Not once. She found Dante exactly where she knew she would find him. Standing near the edge of the room with a glass he had not touched, watching the reception quietly resume around him the way a man watches weather from a window, present but unhurried, content to observe without needing to participate. The string quartet had started again, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as the room collectively decided that the most dignified thing to do with what had just happened was to fold it neatly into the evening and carry on. People are remarkably good at that when the alternative is acknowledging how much they have just witnessed. Dante looked at her as she approached and asked nothing, which was one of the things she had always valued most about him, the understanding that some moments do not need a debrief, they simply need someone willing to stand in them with you until they pass. "Ready?" he asked. She considered the question with genuine honesty, the way she had learned to consider things after years of making decisions that other people had to live with. She looked back across the room one final time. Sandra was deep in conversation with someone new, already rebuilding her map of the evening around the craters tonight had left in it. The bride and her new husband had found each other again on the small dance floor, turning slowly in the particular way of two people who have temporarily forgotten there is anyone else in the room. Julian was seated alone at a table near the window, his corsage slightly askew, his champagne untouched, staring at the middle distance with the expression of a man doing the uncomfortable arithmetic of a life that has just shown him its honest ledger. Bianca looked at him for a moment, and felt something move through her that was not triumph, and was not pity, and was not the complicated grief of old wounds being reopened. It was lighter than any of those things. It was the feeling of a woman who has just realized that she is no longer carrying something she had grown so accustomed to carrying that she had stopped noticing the weight of it. The years of whispers, the quiet shame she had borrowed from other people's expectations and somehow made her own. The story they had built around her absence of a ring, as though a ring were the only architecture a life could be measured by. She forgave Julian Reese in that moment, not because he had earned it, and certainly not because he had asked for it. She forgave him the way you open a window in a room that has been closed too long, not for the room's sake, but because you yourself need the air. It was the cleanest thing she had done all evening. She turned back to Dante. "Ready," she said. They moved through the room together, and the guests who had spent the better part of the evening assembling their quiet judgments about Bianca now parted for her in the instinctive way that people make room for someone they have abruptly and thoroughly reconsidered. She did not slow down for any of it. At the entrance, the same threshold she had stood at hours ago with clenched fingers and a rehearsed breath, she paused for just a moment. Not out of hesitation, but because some exits deserve to be felt properly before you take them. The warm ballroom light fell across her shoulders one last time, catching the crimson of her gown the way it had when she first walked in, only everything that the colour meant had shifted entirely. She had walked in wearing red like a question. She walked out wearing it like an answer. And somewhere behind her, in a room full of people who would be talking about this evening for years, the night finally settled into what it had always quietly been. Not a story about a woman who arrived alone, but a story about a woman who left completely free,